there's sort of a themes each day as we go through, and here we're going to talk about the one we must learn to trust, who the real wise man really is. Now, I've always gotten the impression that real men aren't supposed to read directions. I don't know where I got that from, but I think you're just supposed to look at something and tinker with it and figure it out. And I know some of you people out there can do that. If any of you know my dad, many of you do, you know he can fix just about anything except cars. And he can figure out how to put just about anything together. At some point in my life, I don't exactly remember when this was, but I recall my dad saying, "I always read the directions." And that gives me a sense of hope. Because if my dad, who can fix almost anything, reads directions, then maybe it's okay for me to read directions too. It was a cold winter day in Minnesota, and I was huddled underneath the stairs of an apartment building that I managed and lived in and did the maintenance for. And under the stairs, the reason I was there is all the different valves that were connected to the boiler system that went to the individual apartments. And the heat wasn't working, and I was trying to figure it out. It was cold, and it wasn't just cold for me, but it was cold for everybody in the building until I could figure it out. So there's a little bit of pressure. When I was doing maintenance, I had a small toolbox. Not a lot, but do you know what my most important tool was? It was my cell phone. I called my dad a lot during those years. I still do now. But asking for advice, I called the plumber a lot. I had this great plumber. He actually didn't like to come and help. He would just talk me through things because for him it was just a nuisance to come and figure it out. So he would say, "Well, have you tried this? Have you done this?" And I learned my plumbing from a plumber who didn't want to make those calls. I called my boss a lot. I said, "How do you do this?" And I remember him saying, "You think I would know how to do these things, but I just call people." He had the same thing. And they helped me, these people helped me figure things out a lot. So when we talk about Proverbs, I think the first question we have to ask is, why should we study Proverbs? And what we have in Proverbs is a written set of directions given to us by the manufacturer of life, God himself. And if that isn't enough, which it is, these Proverbs are also given to us in a personal way. Wisdom as advice from a father to a son. And so if you want to turn to Proverbs, we'll look at those first 7 verses. If you see there's a couple other verses we'll look at towards the end, but we'll focus on those first 7 verses because it's really the introduction of the whole book of Proverbs, and it tells us what the point of Proverbs is. Proverbs 1 through 7 gives us the introduction. It says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and the riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." So, why should we study Proverbs? These are some questions. We're going to look at these. I'm not going to actually have you give me some input on some of them, but why should we study Proverbs? Verses 1 through 7, we've read over. What will a wise man do? What will a man of understanding do? How does one begin the path of knowledge? And lastly, why is God trustworthy? We'll jump into those last few Proverbs. But as we read through those 7 verses, what did you hear? Why should we study Proverbs? What are some things that you picked up on? Discernment. Yeah, we need lots of that. What else? What else do you hear in there?
It was written by Solomon, and he was reported to be the wisest man that ever lived.
Yeah. So get your wisdom from wise people. That's right.
Not to look like a fool.
Okay. Not to look like a fool. And that goes a long ways in life, just avoiding foolishness. In the words of a wise man, Joe Madden, he said, "Try not to suck," is what he tells the Cubs. So what do we learn about Proverbs? Well, Proverbs, first of all, teaches us wisdom. You picked up on that. I mean, Proverbs, if you say, where do I go for wisdom? Typically you think, I'm going to go to Proverbs. And Proverbs in here, the first really from verses 2 through 4, give us a number of things that tell us what the purpose of Proverbs. What are they for? And so let's look at some of those. They're for wisdom and instruction. So first of all, to know wisdom. We want to become wise. Well, there's a whole bunch of types of wisdom. I've got the first one up there. But what kind of wisdom are we talking about? We're talking about all kinds of wisdom. So maybe struggling in parenting, whether it's a teenager or a toddler or in between. Trying to navigate a tricky business decision. Wanting to make your marriage and home life better. Wondering what to do with your spare time. What kind of career to go into. How to spend time in retirement. Even navigating a relationship with the Lord. It's all in Proverbs. And it's all that type of wisdom. So to know wisdom, we want to talk about, first of all, there's wisdom as far as like a skill. And in the Old Testament, they were usually talking about a skill of war. But you think about what sort of a skill that would be. Well, it's going to be very practical. It's going to be life-saving. It's going to be protective and offensive at the same time. It's a kind of skill that is helpful in your life. Now, we may not think a lot about warfare skill as something that would be helpful, but there's also wisdom of administration, sort of governance or systems, or having an organized life. We in the Cooper household pray for a wisdom of administration in our household all the time. We're trying to figure out how to run the chore chart and how to homeschool our kids, how to manage the relationships with one another, how to put what kids in what room. Those are a wisdom of administration, of figuring those things out. There's also the wisdom of shrewdness. Usually talk about being shrewdness as a negative thing, but it's really having a good power of judgment. I talked about discernment, being able to judge between right and wrong, having a concept of what is, when something is said, is there truth in that statement or not? This is a kind of wisdom that we need in today's world. Certainly then there's the wisdom of prudence in religious affairs. In other words, read this as in our relationship with God. What does our relationship with God look like? What should it look like? What is that going to be? We can find these in the wisdom of Proverbs. And then there's the wisdom that's sort of ethical and religious wisdom. In other words, to know between right and wrong. That's an important part of wisdom. How to be a good neighbor. There's a proverb, and I've made it a discipline. I think I read through Proverbs 3 times a year. And so I can tell you, there's a lot of Proverbs pop in my head, and I don't know the exact verses where they're at. But one says, to bless your neighbor in the morning is like a curse to him. How do you be a good neighbor? Well, don't go out yelling and singing at 6 a.m. in the morning. Right? So just the common sense of like, what's it mean to be a good neighbor? We can find these in Proverbs. And then the wisdom of to know what pleases God and what displeases God. These are the kind of wisdom we're looking for. So to know wisdom, but the second part of that is instruction. To want to know instruction. When we think of instruction, we usually think of like signing up for a class and like taking a bunch of notes. But in the Hebrew concept of instruction is discipline, chastening, and correction. These are instruction that usually we think of when we're in trouble, or instruction that we're not that fond of. But this is a kind of wisdom that Blake was talking about, of just not being a fool. Like sometimes we just need someone to say, hey, you're being an idiot. Stop doing that. You can find that kind of instruction in Proverbs. So we see the purpose of Proverbs, to know wisdom and instruction. Now if you keep going in the verses, the next thing it talks about is to discern sayings. And specifically, sayings of understanding is how the NESB says it anyway, in verse 2. And I think the concept of discernment, again, that Nancy talked about, is the helpful word for me is distinguishing. So you hear a phrase and you say, well, is that true or not? Is that a good thing to ponder, or is it something I should refuse? And the discernment to know that, because what happens is they get really intermingled. And let me give you a couple of examples that I saw when I was in Washington, D.C. last week. One was a t-shirt that said, love means love. Now that's a true statement. Love means love. The question we have to ask, the discernment, understanding the saying, is what we're talking about, that Proverbs can help us, is, well, what do you mean by love? Are you defining love as God defines love? Are you defining love based on your feelings or your emotions or just what is trendy for the moment? So yes, love means love, but what do you mean when you mean love? Another t-shirt I saw was, and this is a common trend, phrase you might hear, be true to yourself. Be true to yourself. Now that is a true statement. You should be true to yourself. God has created each and every one of us uniquely and differently. We have different gifts and abilities and talents. He's put us in different parts of the country and the world. He put us here in this time and location for a reason. And we're not like anybody else. We're unique. So we need to be true to ourselves. Now the other part of this statement, though, is to recognize that part of ourself is sin nature. And if we're true to that self, if I'm true to the self that just takes care of my own desires and my selfishness and my greed, oh, I'm just going to be true to myself. That's just who I am. Well, that's saying I refuse to change, I refuse to be humbled, I refuse to repent, and that's not the self we want to be true to. And so there's just a couple examples. Those sayings, we're talking about discerning sayings, are everywhere on bumper stickers and t-shirts a lot of times, but just things that are said, phrases, posters, and we need to be able to discern them. Proverbs can help us do that. So discern the sayings, specifically of understanding. A third category then is to receive instruction. And first of all, in receiving instruction, we have to want to receive instruction. If we want to receive instruction, then the Lord can teach us in all sorts of ways. Through other people's mistakes, through our mistakes, through books, through learning, through classes, a remarkable number of ways. But if we don't want to receive instruction, and there's a list of different things to receive instruction from, what Proverbs calls us then, we fall in the category of naive, or simple, or foolish. There's probably some other words, but those are some of the nicer ones. So what should we be receiving instruction in? So first of all, wise behavior, that sort of much speaks for itself. We want to behave wisely. We want to behave in a way that honors the Lord, that people look at that and say, wow, that person knows what they're doing. I mean, all of us want to do it. When we're at work, we want to behave in a way people say, wow, that person knows their job. They're proficient. It's wise behavior. But also, we want to receive instruction in righteousness, simply to know what is right and to walk in that way. Receive instruction in justice. That would be just treatment for others. So again, how are we relating to one another? And then to receive instruction in equity, evenness, or being impartial or fair. What does that look like? If you were in the place of a judge, how would you disperse equity to people? So there's some receiving of instruction. The next thing that Proverbs says it's good for is to give prudence, knowledge, and discretion. Now, if you notice this, if you look there, it says, verse 4, it says, prudence goes to the naive, or again, the simple ones. And prudence could be described as having a caution or a common sense. You've heard the phrase that common sense isn't common, or if common sense was more common, it'd be a better off. That's in a sense what prudence is. And prudence, so the naive, the simple, the like, oh, it's no big deal, what could go wrong? Right? That's the sort of the naive statement. A little bit of common sense, a little bit of prudence would be helpful. Well, wisdom, Proverbs can help give that kind of wisdom. But then the knowledge and discretion is said to be given to the youth. You know, there's all sorts of opinions about what the youth need these days. But God promises to the youth who would take the time to study this book two things: knowledge and discretion. Knowledge could be described as facts, information, and skills. So you think about that. Facts are just stuff you learn, memorize it and spit it back out. Information might be helpful. Some people describe wisdom as applied knowledge. So you take these facts and you take this information, you take these skills, and then you apply it to real life. Now you've got wisdom. But you've got to start, those are like the building blocks. And it can be acquired, knowledge can be acquired by a person through experience. In other words, figure it out yourself, or education, have someone else show you how it's done. Some of those are easier than others. Sometimes people say you got to learn your own mistakes, or you can learn from the mistakes of others. Some people choose the easy way and some the hard way. You can also learn knowledge by theoretically or practically. There's some subjects I will never go beyond theoretical knowledge of giving birth. This isn't going to happen, but I can understand how it works, so I can be a better husband to my wife when she has to go through that, and I can get the theoretical part of that. Some of the knowledge is just practical that we need. And then the third part, so we talk about the youth need knowledge and discretion. So knowledge in our culture as a whole, I think we do pretty good about this. I mean, we really value education. We can learn a lot of different things, go into a lot of different areas where we can get this knowledge. I think the part that we miss often is the second part of discretion. Discretion would be some similar things like this would be counsel. So like surrounding yourself with wise people. A lot of times, it's just kind of like the herd mentality, just running after the people around you, and the people around you are doing it, so I'm going to do that too, and whatever is trendy and fashionable, that's what I want to do now. These gizmos just started coming out and being popular. What are those called? What are they called? Yeah, the fidget spinners, right? So they're made for people who have ADD and like help them focus. And then all of a sudden, like every person on the planet needs a fidget spinner because it's cool and trendy. So there's a sense of like, okay, what kind of counsel are we surrounding ourselves with? That's a sense of discretion. Going back to prudence, just some general common sense. That's part of discretion. And then craftiness, and I use that word in the sense of this, like having a purpose in life, or having a skill or a task that you're about, that you're focused on, that you're working on. These sort of things, under the concept of discretion, I think are lacking way more than knowledge. I think our culture says, yeah, knowledge is important, let's do that. But the discretion needs to go with the knowledge for it to really be useful. And can you just imagine, think about what difference it would make for the future of our nation and our world, not to mention our own lives, if the youth received knowledge and discretion. I mean, that's really what we're praying for our future. And by the way, there are some pretty old people who could also use some knowledge and discretion. So when you read the word youth, don't think it's limited just to young people. Some people don't grow up. I mean, there are 30-plus-year-olds living in their parents' basement playing video games. They're still youth. I don't care how old they are. All right? So now we see the purpose of Proverbs, what it looks like, and what we can gather from it. There's a number of things. And then we get down to verse 5, and it talks about a wise man. So verse 5, according to verse 5, what does it say a wise man will do? What do you see in there?
Listen.
He'll listen. Do you know what happens when we're listening? We're not talking. Yeah, if we're listening, we're not talking. So think about this. A wise man will hear more than he talks. And do you know what happens when we listen more than we talk? We increase in learning. We increase in learning. So just take time. This alone, if you just like learn to surround yourself with wise people and listen to them, you're off to a really good start. Like that alone will cover a lot of valuable life lessons that you could do. Now look at the second part of verse 5. What will a man of understanding do? What does that say?
Surround himself with wise people.
Okay, there we go. So for first part, we're going to listen. Now, if you're just listening to stupid stuff, you're not going to get wise. Jesus talked about the blind leading the blind. They both fall into a pit. While stupid people are basically blind without a blindfold. They just, think bungee cord jumping is cool or something like that. My apologies to any of you who've ever tried bungee cord jumping. But you think about this. A man of understanding, it says, well, he will acquire wise counsel. He will surround himself with wise people. Well, is that so he can hey, look at all the smart people around me to impress him? No, there's a purpose. And the purpose is to understand, to gain understanding. And what are they trying to understand? Well, here's a whole list of things. He talks about Proverbs. Well, okay, we're studying the book of Proverbs. Any wise saying is a proverb. There's proverbs that aren't in the book of Proverbs. There's proverbs from Chinese proverbs, and just wise people saying things can be proverbs. But also in that category would be parables. Well, think about it. Jesus told a lot of parables. These are wise sayings that we might need wise people around us to help understand. A figure would be something that needs interpretation. So like a figure of speech. A lot of times if you're learning a new language, The figures of speech don't translate very well. If you're with someone whose English is their second language, and we say something that's a figure of speech, they'll be like, what do you mean? Because they're thinking of it literally. Well, we need wise people around us to help us figure out those figures. Just the words of the wise alone. Wise people sometimes say things that are over our head because we're maybe not quite as wise as they are yet. And so it's okay to be like, well, what did you mean by that? And can you help me understand that? That's words of the wise. And then the riddles. Think about the riddles. It could be something that's difficult to understand or maybe interpret. Something maybe that's a little mysterious. Or maybe just a difficult question that's a little hard to navigate. Or maybe a saying that's really perplexing, like you just don't quite know what it means or what it's talking about. These would be all under the category of a riddle of the wise. And if you surround yourself, if you go back to the beginning, you're surrounding yourself with wise people so that you can understand all these things in life that are kind of hard to understand. And we see that. Now, let me, second to last question I have for you, which is from verse 7. How does one begin the path of knowledge? Now we say wisdom is good. We know we want to do these things, but how do we begin the path of knowledge?
Fear of the Lord.
The fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord. And we don't need to make this complicated. That's it. It's not like a whole list of things. But we think about what does it mean to fear the Lord? To reverence, to be mindful of His power, of His holiness. One way, I think the best, I don't know the best, but one way to think about the fear of the Lord is think about not making too little of God. I think a lot of times we don't necessarily put God in the proper place. He just becomes a little God. And I don't think that is the proper fear of the Lord. If we recognize that God is powerful, His love is powerful, His grace is powerful, His mercy is powerful, His wrath is powerful, His holiness is powerful. He is big and mighty. And the fear of the Lord kind of keeps that in perspective. Now, so we talk about the fear of the Lord is how we begin that path to knowledge. If we want to start, you got to start with the fear of the Lord. What happens if we start with something else other than the fear of the Lord? What happens is that we end up with a very different and corrupt version of knowledge. So let me give you an example, a contrast, if you will. This is a purely hypothetical, so hopefully it doesn't apply to you. 2 graduates from uw-whitewater. Okay, one student has learned the key to getting ahead in life is to remember the eternal perspective, that no matter what happens in life, he must never forget the power and holiness of God. He said that's the key. That's the beginning of knowledge. Now, a second student has learned the key to getting ahead in life is to make sure to get a secure, good, well-paying job that will lead to future advancement in job security. Now that's, they'd be a good citizen. That's not a bad thing. Now let's say both of these students both get a job at Kohl's. Kohl's hires lots of people from Whitewater. That could happen. They both work very hard. Don't think of anybody in your mind right now, okay? They both work very hard. So one of them is working really hard in a way that would please the Lord and bring honor to Him. And the other one is working really hard, hopefully to get noticed by the supervisor and rise up through the ranks. Now, they've been there for 6 months. It's time for a 6-month review. The supervisor calls them in one at a time, and he says she's considering one of them for a promotion. Now, in order for that to happen, this is all it needs. The supervisor simply asks them that they take some of their May sales and apply them to June so that June looks like a really good month, and that will give them, the supervisor, an opportunity to promote one of them, and the supervisor can also get a promotion to the next step up. Now, what will happen? Now, if our foundation in life is job security and future advancement, if that's what we say is the beginning of wisdom, what will happen is this. We'll start to justify and think of reasons and rationalize, and so we convince ourselves in our mind it's really not a big deal to get. Once I get promoted to that position, I can fix it and it'll be okay. But if our foundation is the fear of the Lord, we would rather lose our job than have to explain before an almighty, powerful God why we made that decision. Do you see the difference that it makes of where we begin our quest for wisdom? It says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. If we begin with something else, we get a very different result. And so it's important to begin in the right way. Which leads us then to the second reason of why we should study Proverbs. So we talked about Proverbs, it teaches us wisdom, but it also points us to God. And we've talked about who God is. One thing is that God is trustworthy. And so if you just turn the next couple chapters over, this is a common memory verse. So some of you might know this, have this memorized, but Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says to trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. So my question for you is, why is God trustworthy? What do you see in that passage that makes God trustworthy? Yeah.
First of all, I think he's kind of a part of all our ways. Like in verse 6 it says, in all your ways acknowledge him. So it means you can acknowledge him in everything.
Yeah.
Present, and then he makes our paths straight.
Yeah. Yeah. So his ability to make our paths straight makes him trustworthy. In one sense, part of that trustworthiness of God is remembering, which the Israelites did not do very well, and we often don't do well, remembering what God has already done. Remember how he has come through in the past, how he has made our paths straight, and remember that he will also do that in the future. So you think about the concept of this. God is trustworthy. He's telling us to trust in him, but he also is saying it should be with all of our heart. We are to trust the Lord with all of our heart. So that means not trust in the Lord with all my heart or with some of my heart, not trust in the Lord and my finances, not trust in the Lord and my position at work, not trust in the Lord and my family, not trust in the Lord and my abilities, but trust in the Lord with all my heart. And that leads to the second thing, not on my own understanding. And Bob and I were talking about this morning in a men's study. Sometimes we think we have lots of great answers. We think we can, we can figure something out better than God can figure something out. Let me tell you, as we read through Proverbs, there are some great truths in this book that are always true. They were true when Solomon wrote them thousands and thousands of years ago, and they're still true today, and they'll be true when Jesus comes back. And sometimes we think we can figure it out better than what God already revealed to us. So not lean on our understanding. Now I'm not saying walk around stupid. Like, God has given us a brain, and we can figure things out, but sometimes we try so hard to figure things out that we kind of leave God in the dust. So we want to trust God with all of our heart, not God plus anything, and not lean on our own understanding, but trust God's understanding. And again, that's why we're going through Proverbs. And then to acknowledge God in all of our ways. That's what Abby was talking about. When we acknowledge God, when we say, God, I'm putting you first, the beginning of the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. I'm going to start with you. I acknowledge you in all my ways, everything I do. Then what happens is he makes our paths straight. He doesn't make our paths easy, by the way. He makes them straight. There's a difference. He's not going to remove every obstacle, but he's going to be with us to go up and over the obstacles or down around the obstacles. We're going to stay straight and focused on the Lord. And when we focus on the Lord, we see the strength that he is. So we see that God is trustworthy, and Proverbs will show us that. But Proverbs will also show us, the last proverb I want us to look at today is Proverbs 18:10. It says, the name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it, and they are safe. It is a safe place. And so we see that Proverbs points us to God who is trustworthy, and he is strong. He is a strong tower. And that is the name of the Lord. The name of the Lord is everything he is, his character, his person. Everything there is about God is wrapped up in his name. There's power in his name. And it is a strong tower. When we're on vacation, we're in some wilderness areas, and they always have some signs about lightning strikes. And they have this scale of safety for lightning strikes. I don't know if you've ever seen this. But if you're on top of a hill in a clearing with, like, you're the highest point, you're on a scale of 0 to 10, you're at this point of 0. You're in the dumbest place you could be. So that's a really bad spot. Now, if you go down the hill a little bit, and maybe there's some trees around you, so you're not the highest point anymore, or maybe there's some boulders around you and you can crouch down, Now they call that the point of 1. Okay, you're not at the worst point, but you're pretty darn close. If you go down and you can find a valley or a ditch to lay down in, so now you're like protected, you're certainly the lowest point you can find. They call that a point of 2. That's pretty good. You're certainly, not at the highest point. The likelihood of getting struck by lightning is way less down in a ditch than anywhere else. But then on the scale, they have a 10. It's cars and buildings. And I think their whole point is, I think they've always talked about people trying to seek shelter from lightning, and they go find a ditch or crouch down. And those, that'll get you from a 0 to a 2. But if you want to go find a 10, get in a car and get in a building. If there's something nearby, do that. And that is like this tower, the strong tower. Sometimes we can be crouched down in our little ditch, looking up at the people up on the hill and be like, aren't they so stupid? They're going to get struck up there. And we think we're safe because we're using our own thinking, our own ability, our own strength to get ourselves to a position of 2, when God is saying, no, run into the building. I am the strong tower. I am the 10. And now Solomon didn't know this when he was writing it, but what he was hoping for and looking towards was the strong tower of Jesus Christ. It says the righteous run into the strong tower. Now we are not righteous. We won't make ourselves righteous and then we run into the strong tower. We're righteous because we are running to the strong tower of Jesus Christ. It is Jesus who makes us righteous, and it's Jesus who is the tower. So as we run into it, we become righteous. And then what do we find? We find that safety is found in the strong tower. Safety is not found anywhere else. You might feel a little bit better laying in that ditch and saying, hey, at least I'm not on top of the mountain, but you're still not safe. You're still trying to figure it out on your own. Safety is found in the strong tower of Jesus Christ. And there's nowhere else. It pales in comparison. Anywhere else we could try and hide does that for us. So these are just really an introduction to Proverbs as we begin to see. And so here's my summary statement. Proverbs teaches us wisdom because it points to God, who is trustworthy and is a strong tower. And my prayer is that we will make much of Him throughout our study this summer. As we go through Proverbs, we will see time and again the character of God and gather some of this wisdom, this practical, knowledgeable wisdom that we can use in our lives.